already sitting comfortably. Okay, first thing, we've got two things on today, Marxist programme, and followed by communism and trade unions. We're going to start 15 minutes late. So is it okay if we just finish 15 minutes later? Instead of 4:15, finish at 4:30, unless that's going to cause problems for anyone.
We've got the room till 6.
Okay, to start off then, we've got Mc.Nair from the CPGB discussing the Marxist programme.
Okay. Good afternoon, comrades. I'm speaking very roughly to the argument of a series which I wrote in August, September last year in the Weekly Worker on permanent revolution and programmes, and transitional programmes and maximum minimum programmes and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into anything like the sort of level of detail that the 5 2 double-page articles in this series go into. And I'm going to start, rather than starting with the concrete, I'm going to start at a fairly abstract level and then work down. My starting point is the question, what is a programme? And why a party has to have a programme? Basically, a programme is a coherent set of proposals for the future course of the whole society. When we say that there is a Marxist programme, the core of this programme is expressed most clearly in the opening of the programme of the French Workers' Party from the 1870s, 1880 approximately, that the emancipation of the working class cannot take place without taking over the means of production, that the means of production cannot be laid hold of individually. There are only two forms in which the working class can take over hold of the means of production. One is the individual form, which is ceasing to exist, and the other is the collective form. And that therefore the working class has to fight for political power to control the means of production at the level of the society as a whole. And in order to do this, the working class needs to organise itself, the class as a whole, into a political party to take power. So the basic idea is that there is no road to socialism other than the self-emancipation of the working class, that there is no road to the self-emancipation of the working class other than the struggle for socialism, communism, more accurately, and that struggle is, in essence, a struggle for political power in the society as a whole, and in fact that the emancipation of the working class is the road to the emancipation of all humanity. So a coherent set of proposals for the future course of the whole society, not just a set of proposals for the benefit of the members of Unite or a particular group within society. Secondly, programme defines and shapes a political party. Obvious flip side again, trade union, it's meaningless for a trade union as such to have a political programme other than defence of the immediate interests of its members and the people who are eligible to be members. Because a trade union precisely is a corporate group within the society which defends the interests of the particular section of the working class which it represents. A programme is necessary, and it's necessary for a political party because it's the assertion that a political party is necessary is the assertion that the working class needs to take the lead in society as a whole, and not simply to defend sectional interests within the existing order of society. Third point, having a short summary programme is essential to the democratic functioning of a political party. Two alternative types of programme. The first is to have a vague and indeterminate programme like most clearly the Socialist Workers' Party or the Labour Party, what you're essentially saying is, trust me, I'm Tony, I'm a good guy, or trust me, I'm John Rees, I'm a good guy, as John Rees absolutely explicitly said at the founding conference of Respect. I'm a long-time activist, we speak for the voiceless, vote for me and support me. So that a vague and indeterminate political programme unavoidably boils down to support the leadership. And it's counterposed to the idea of the working class itself taking political decisions about what it wants to do. Secondly, however, that's equally true of another sort of programme, which is an enormously long programme. Example, the programme of the Mandelaite Fourth International consists of the theses, resolutions and manifestos of the first four congresses of the Comintern, of the International Left Opposition and International Communist League in the 1930s, and of the Fourth International from its founding in 1938 to its, I think, 15th or 16th World Congress is the most recent World Congress. Similarly, the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, the programme of the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, the AWL comrades explicitly say, is not some document which would just be words on paper, but the whole political record of the workers' fight tendency from its foundation in the late 1960s. Well, both of these sorts of these sorts of programs, which aren't documents as such, but are programs nonetheless, are anti-democratic. And the reason is because actually, who the hell can know, apart from Sean Mc.Nair, what the whole record of, perhaps Bruce Robinson and Martin Thomas, what the whole record of the workers' fight tendency from its founding in the late 1960s is? Who can know, without having the resources of a major research library, what is actually contained in the documents of the first four congresses of the Comintern and of the International Left Opposition and all the congresses of the Fourth International between 1938 and 2000, or whatever the last congress was. So it collapses back, in fact, into trust the leaders and don't make concrete political choices. In order to make concrete political choices, it's necessary to have a party which is founded on a programme which is a short, clear summary of a set of political positions which are the coherent political positions which the party puts forward as the course of the future of the whole society. Second point, why a maximum programme and a minimum programme? The maximum programme means, well, I should say before I say anything else, that this expression minimum programme is from Marx. It's not anybody else's invention, it's Karl Marx's invention. Yeah? Describing the programme of the Parti Ouvrier, the French Workers' Party, in correspondence. The maximum programme merely means the general aim of communism. We set the aim that the self-emancipation of the working class involves the struggle for communism, that the struggle for communism involves the self-emancipation of the working class. The collective appropriation of the means of production, which is not the same thing as state appropriation of the means of production. And the collective appropriation of the means of production implies the end of classes, the end of the state, because the state is a particular form of private appropriation of the means of production, the end of intellectual property in the form of privately possessed knowledge and skills, which forms the basis of the middle class as a professional managerial middle class as a distinct group within society, and also the end of the family in its present form, the family as it, and indeed I say its present form, but the common elements of the form of the family, which has existed for approximately the last 4,000 years, which is a system of essentially adult male appropriates the labour of a female. Recent calculation a bloke who is married gets £30,000 a year worth of labour out of his wife. And in small family businesses and farms, it's also the case that the father appropriates the labour of the children. We've seen a caricature form of that in this Austrian case recently, where his gross patriarchy turned into a disgusting caricature. But the underlying the end of the patriarchal family is a necessary part of there being socialism, there being common communism, there being collective appropriation of the means of production. So we're really talking about, when we talk about communism, or when we talk about full socialism, like Hillel Tichtin, I think basically we're talking about the same thing when we say socialism and communism in this sense. We're talking about a society which is profoundly different from our own, a society which is as different from our own society as modern society is different from the city-states of medieval Italy. Now, and it's not serious to suppose that we can leap instantaneously from the present society to that society. Why is it not serious? The reason is because although capitalism partially socializes the means of production, partially in a deformed, in a contradictory way, capitalism socializes the means of production. Nobody would imagine that steel production, for example, could return to petty production by family owners of small hearths of the sort which was carried on in this city in the 18th century. But capitalism nonetheless leaves intact, or not leaves intact, but there continues to exist a large petty proprietor class. And that large petty proprietor class has two sides. The first is that there is traditional family business in niche aspects of the market, and in some areas which are actually economically very important. Agriculture is a particular case. It's a peculiar example, because what's happened is that the level of mechanisation of agriculture is now so high that it's possible to run a family business on the scale of what used to be an agricultural operation which would employ 250, 300 workers. Secondly, on the other hand, I referred to the private ownership of intellectual property in the form of skills and privatisation of information. And that is a large middle class. Generally speaking, that middle class expands even as the traditional petty proprietor middle class declines. Now, that middle class can be turned into skilled workers. Substance teachers, who were undoubtedly, before the last war, an element of the middle class, are now undoubtedly an element of the skilled working class. But there is a decisive element of that middle class, which is the labour bureaucracy. The labour bureaucracy appropriates the information of the workers' movement and the decision-making powers of the workers' movement as an organised group. And in order to defend the individual's career interests in control of that information at the expense of the members, enters into alliance with the capitalist class. So that the labour bureaucracy, as a section of the middle class, and for that matter, the state bureaucracy and so on and so forth, at the end of the day, the working class is going to have to exercise control over the middle class. It's not going to be able to abolish it at a single act and leap in a single act of the revolution into the kingdom of freedom. So our maximum program is the long-term goal of communism. the minimum programme, why a minimum programme? What the hell, minimum programme? The answer is the minimum programme is the minimum requirements under which communists would enter into government or support a government. Until the possibility exists of implementing the minimum programme, the Workers' Party, Marx and Engels argue from the outset, and Kautsky argues in his earlier revolutionary phase, should remain an intransigently oppositional party. It should not enter into coalition governments. It should prefer to be in opposition to a grand coalition of the left and the right of the bourgeois parties, to being in coalition with the left of the bourgeois parties. Why? Well, at one level, it's simply a balance sheet, Marx and Engels' balance sheet of Louis Blanc, who entered into coalition with the left wing of the bourgeois parties, socialist leader who entered into coalition with the left wing of the bourgeois parties in 1848, and the result was to discredit his political ideas and his political party, and to pave the way for the coup of Louis Bonaparte in France. That balance sheet is one which Marx and Engels maintained the repeated statements in forms of advice to workers' organisations and communist organisations in Europe from the 1850s through to Engels' advice to the Italian socialists in the 1890s. Continuously maintained position. We are not prepared to enter into government until we can, until the circumstances are right for us to begin the programme of the working class taking over. That balance sheet is emphatically confirmed, unambiguously and clearly confirmed by the whole history of the global workers' movement since, well, actually, during the 20th century, for practical purposes. The bizarre, peculiar exception which the visual communists built on, and it turns out in 1989 to 91 not to be an exception, was the post-war socialist communist coalition governments in Eastern Europe, which turn into Stalinist regimes. And if you believed that the Stalinist regimes were socialism, then you could believe that by being in a coalition government, as long as you controlled the Ministry of Police and the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Defence, you could take over the state. What is the content of the minimum programme? The core of the minimum programme, in programmes which Marx and Engels were concerned in the drafting of, is a set of political demands, the demands of the Democratic Republic, the abolition of the standing army, the election and recallability of all officials, full local control of the police. Economic demands enter into these political demands only to the extent that they're immediately connected to politics. Repudiation of the state debt, nationalisation, the return to the state of the lands held in Maine is part of one of the demands of the French Workers' Party. What it means in English terms is the nationalisation of the lands of the church and of lands of institutions like Oxford and Cambridge University, which have vast land holdings. So the core of this programme is a programme of political democracy, freedom of movement of the workers, freedom to organise trade unions, and so on. But then, going alongside that, Marx, very explicit on this point, some demands which have been immediately raised by the workers' movement itself. The classic example being the demand for the 8-hour day. The 8-hour day looks like a fairly, well, it used to look like a fairly minimalist demand. Now it's beginning to look like a demand which we ought to be fighting for again. But these are demands, these demands are not arbitrarily, they make a lot of point of this, these demands are not arbitrarily selected, they are demands which are raised by the workers' movement itself. Now, we actually can't just say demands raised by the workers' movement itself, and the reason why we can't just say demands raised by the workers' movement itself is because, as I said before, the workers' movement has been captured and is now controlled for all practical purposes by the labour bureaucracy. So the demands which spontaneously come out of TNGW Unite are labour bureaucracy, social democratic demands. The demands which spontaneously come out of the Labour Party more transparently are reform proposals in the interests of the national capitalist state. But the other side of this coin, we have to be careful to avoid a utopian scheme in which we say, à la Proudhon, socialism will come about through cooperatives. Or Lassalle, socialism will come about through state-supported cooperatives. Or in which we say, I've said full socialism involves the abolition of the patriarchal family, but what will replace the patriarchal family in terms of its social functions in the upbringing of children? The truth is we don't fucking know. And there's very little indication. There's no reason to suppose that state education represents the future of childcare. Or that, for that matter, that the enormous expansion of domestic servants in recent British capitalism represents the future of housework. So what we have to be saying is, at the end of the day, the choices about how socialism will be constructed are choices that the working class itself as a class will make when political power is transferred into the hands of the working class. The minimum programme is not about a utopian scheme of the economy. The minimum programme is about the transfer of political power into the hands of the working class. The minimum programme is the overthrow of the capitalist state order. It's not anything less than the overthrow of the capitalist state order. Now, what Kautsky did, of course, was to make it into something less than the overthrow of the capitalist state order. Kautsky, in the Social Revolution in 1902, he changes the meaning of the minimum programme from being the overthrow of the capitalist state order to being that the working class will accomplish the uncompleted tasks of the bourgeois revolution. And the way in which the question has been formulated ever since the social revolution, in Trotsky's writings, in Lenin's writings, it's formulated in the terms of Kautsky's The Social Revolution, that the minimum programme is not the overthrow of the capitalist state order, but the completion of the uncompleted tasks of the bourgeois revolution. Similarly, the Democratic Republic changes its meaning. For Engels and Marx, the Democratic Republic means the Paris Commune, and a state like the Paris Commune. And that actually is what it would have meant for anybody in the 19th century before the late 19th century. The Democratic Republic means a republic in which the people at large rule, not the rule of law constitutional state. It means an Athenian democracy, not a Roman republicanism. Kautsky, in contrast, turns that around and says the Democratic Republic means the rule of law constitutional state as it exists in the United States, perhaps as it exists in Britain, in spite of the fact it plays a bloody monarchy, as it exists in the United States, in the Netherlands, again, a monarchy. By doing so, actually, Kautsky de-guts the minimum programme and leaves behind only the immediate demands which have been raised by the workers' movement. And it's a real paradox that what happened after that is that the Bolsheviks did the same bloody thing in a different way. What the Bolsheviks did was that they took power in 1917 on the morrow, contrary to what the anarchists say, it is not the case that the Russian Civil War started in May 1918. The Russian Civil War started on the morrow of the revolution. From the morrow of the revolution, the white generals were aiming to take back power. They were engaged in military operations, and the Mensheviks, the central core of the Mensheviks and the right social revolutionaries, were backing the white generals, backing the military cadets, military academy cadets, in their attempts to take back power. And the nationalists too. The Finnish nationalists backed Mannerheim, but Mannerheim's intention, if he hadn't been militarily defeated, was to take back Petrograd and restore the Tsar. So on the morrow of the revolution, they were in civil war conditions. And in those civil war conditions, they were forced to take very extensive emergency measures. Imagine that it had not been the Bolsheviks, not been a workers' party, but had been some, let's call them, but for the sake of argument, Jacobins, yeah? A bourgeois radical party based on the workers and the urban petty bourgeoisie and a section of the peasantry. They would still have had, if they were not going to hand power back to the Tsar, they would still have had to take emergency measures. They would still have had to suppress the Mensheviks who adhered to the white generals. But what the Bolsheviks did in 1920-21 was to sanctify those emergency measures. They said the working class can't hold power except through a vanguard party, which is a minority, which politically represents the mass. And that's not just, they said, that is not just a theory for Russia, that's a theory, they said, in the Comintern documents, for the whole of the world. The dictatorship of the proletariat means the dictatorship of the proletarian party. The consequence of that choice, in terms of the theory of the program, is to gut, just as Kautsky gutted the minimum program of its political content of the overthrow of the bourgeois state, so actually the Bolsheviks have also done the same thing, because they've reduced the fact that the Communist Party is a communist party to trusting the leadership and to economic changes. That's very visible in, this is an example of what not to do. It's the program of the Communist International adopted in the 5th Congress, I think it is, 6th Congress in 1928. It's difficult to get hold of. Most people are familiar with it only through Trotsky's critique. Trotsky doesn't critique the core of it, which is what the Comintern calls the program of transition. What comes to be called the transitional program, though it isn't the same thing as the transitional program. They call it this program of transition is in essence simply a program of nationalising everything and the leading role of the Communist Party and bringing mass organisations under the tutelage of the Communist Party. It's a program which says the way forward for everyone is to follow what the Russians did. It de-guts the political democratic content of the traditional, of the minimum program. It does so because the Bolsheviks were engaged in a debate with Kautsky, Martov, etc., in which Kautsky, Martov, etc., was representing the democratic program as being defense of the bourgeois state. But the consequence of it is to reduce the program to a program for economic change and the leading role of the party and the whole bureaucratic crap, all the bureaucratic crap associated with it. So I've been going on rather too long, but just the last single point. What's the alternative? The alternative which Trotsky comes up with in the 1938 program and is continuous historically with the line of argument which he and Luxemburg had defended in 1904. And that in turn is continuous historically with Bakunin's arguments. The The way it happens, of course, is Bakunin dies. Bakuninism reappears as anarcho-syndicalism in the 1890s. Then the right-wing character of the social democratic leaderships in the 1900s leads the left to be influenced by anarcho-syndicalism. The form in Britain and America is the de Leonist Socialist Labour Party. The forms in France and Germany are different, and so on and so forth. Bakunin's idea is that the working class cannot become conscious, politically conscious, except when it's on strike. The masses are not politically unconscious except insofar as they're actually engaged in struggle. So what we have to do is move the masses into action. And there are only two ways in which you can move the masses into action. One is to, well, it doesn't actually, clearly doesn't bloody work. Bakunin in Lyon in 1870 gets up on the steps of the town hall and proclaims the abolition of the state. Putschs, ultra-leftism, Red Army fraction, propaganda of the deed. We're going to follow Castro's assault on Moncada, etc., etc., etc. That's one line. The other line is to actually reduce the political content of what you're going to argue for to the level at which the masses will move. And in the 1938 program, the level at which Trotsky reduces the political content is the level in substance of trade union consciousness. That he imagines that by vigorously prosecuting the sectional struggle around wages, around unemployment, etc., etc., we can tip it over into Soviets, the general strike, and the insurrection. But the problem, of course, which is posed is, okay, it works. Suppose it works. We tip it over into the general strike. What now? The society cannot exist if everybody's out on strike. There won't be anything to get to eat in the shops. There won't be the economy will be dislocated. The working class has to take over positively. It can't just stop the system. In order to take over positively, it needs a political leadership. It needs to offer a political leadership to the whole of the society. It needs political decision-making mechanisms. In other words, it needs a party. You cannot just walk around. What happens, in fact, is that the general strike happens, the power is passed back into the hands of the labour bureaucracy, as it went back into the hands of the PCF in France, back into the hands of the PCI in Italy, and so on and so forth. The power is passed back into the hands of the labour bureaucracy because the working class needs a political programme, a programme about how decisions are going to be made. It needs a minimum programme. The general strike route does not take us there. Hence, back to my beginning, a party needs a programme. It needs a maximum programme, which in fact we all, more or less, I think, all agree on what the content of the maximum programme is, the whole of the far left. It also needs a minimum programme in order to build itself as a party. Sorry, I don't know how long I took, but fair amount.